What's up friends, Dan here, and I'm excited to talk to you about Tailwind CSS today. So I've been using Tailwind a lot more lately, and I have to say that I'm really enjoying it for a variety of reasons. I have a few more videos planned around Tailwind CSS, as well as rewriting my personal site in it. So I figured I would create this getting started video that I can always reference back to. Before we get started, I just want to let you know that you can find all the source code that we're going to talk about today over at my GitHub account. And there's a repository called Tailwind Getting Started. Also, if you go ahead and look below, I will include a link in the description. So everything that we talk through today is going to be here. Might look a little different after I update the README, but this is a good place to go after you kind of follow along with me. All right, so here we are on tailwindcss.com. We're just gonna walk through the site together a little bit just to learn a little bit more about the CSS framework, what's also known as a utility-first CSS framework, and we'll get into that. But if you want to, this would be a great place to learn a little bit more. We're gonna talk through some of this stuff, and then we're gonna go in and build 3 different demos. And just real quick demos, but I'm going to show you 3 different ways to get started with Tailwind CSS. And the reason I'm going to do that is sometimes I find that people don't want to start up like a brand new project and like do any of the configuration that you need to do just to kind of try something out. So I'll show you easy ways to get on it, to get started, and then we'll kind of incrementally build from there. So here I am on Tailwind. If you head over to Why Tailwind, you can learn a little bit more. I'm going to jump down here and go to this core concepts and go into utility first. And so this is something that you're going to probably see and not like and go, why are we doing it this way? But this is what a utility first framework is. And I want to talk through it and just kind of give you my thoughts on it and my impressions where I was when I first saw this as well. So here's what I like. We start off with, traditionally, whenever you need to style something on the web, you write CSS, right? So if we're building this chit chat box, we have some divs and we start adding some classes to it. So we'll add this chat notification wrapper, and inside of there, we'll then have another wrapper for our logo, and then we have our logo image, and then we have our content, we have a title, and we have a message. And then as we're starting to build this, we keep adding these classes. So we create these classes, and then we come over to our style sheet. We add some styles for that particular class. We go back, we look. This is a process that we just kind of rinse and repeat and do over and over again. And so this works, but it can get kind of noisy and messy going back and forth. What utility first kind of means is that the framework itself provides you all of these little utility classes, like things for margin and padding and colors and widths and heights and text and a whole bunch of all these utility classes. And so instead of creating a class name and then jumping into the CSS and defining the CSS for that class, you're kind of just saying, all right, for this particular wrapper on the outside, these are kind of the characteristics of it, right? So first, it has a MX auto. It has a padding of not 6, but there's Tailwind's utility class of 6. It has a background of white. It has rounded corners. It has a drop shadow on it. And so you can see that you start to add all of these kind of classes to the elements that are going to use them. And so if you look through here, you can see that in the example above we used, and it will kind of tell you exactly what each of those do. And so this is what I like, because kind of had the first impression myself. It says, now I know what you're thinking. This is an atrocity. What a horrible mess. And you're right. It's kind of ugly. In fact, it's just about impossible to think this is a good idea the first time you see it. But you do have to actually try it. And you have to try it and use it over and over again for a little bit till it really kind of sinks in. I know you're probably sitting here going, I should click off this video now. I don't need to watch it. I'm done with this. Don't need to use it. And I get it. I had the same first impressions. Why would I want to just kind of muddy up my code, my markup like this? But the more I got to using it, the more I realized that like I'm doing the same thing, but I'm just going back and forth to this CSS file, defining all these styles, and then it's really hard to like manage CSS files that get really large. So I like doing this. I would say give it a shot before you immediately dismiss it, but that's where we are. So you'll also go through here, and there's some reasons on why this kind of works well. Why not just use inline styles? So there's some reasons not to do that. Some maintainability concerns. What if I create a button and I have the same button style and 100 buttons across my application, and then I want to tweak one button? Well, you could still create your classes and kind of build on them. Using Tailwind's apply feature, you can create some abstractions around common utility patterns. So there are some ways to get at that as well. So that's kind of my introduction to Tailwind. I would encourage you to read through more of the documentation. There's some great screencasts from Adam on introducing you to him as well. But as I said, what I want to do is actually just start and go through 3 different examples that may help you get familiar with Tailwind CSS. All right, so the first example I'm going to show you is over on CodePen.io. And this allows us to go ahead and experiment with some HTML, CSS, JavaScript without having to do everything locally, set up our IDE, set up our text editor, manage files, that kind of thing. So I'm going to come in here, I'm going to create a new pen. And in this pen, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to minimize JavaScript because we're not going to need it. The first thing that I'll do though is come in here and search for a resource, and we're going to use Tailwind. So I could save and close that, and once I've added Tailwind, I can actually minimize this as well because we aren't going to be using any CSS. And in fact, let's go ahead and change this view, and we'll do more of a split screen here. So you're going to be spending some time when you're first using Tailwind jumping back and forth to the documentation if you don't know all of these utility classes. And I don't still know all of these utility classes. I'm constantly jumping in the documentation, but I know a bulk of them. And so that gives me, you know, that 80-20 rule gets me 80% of the way. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to create a container div. So container, and we'll talk about why we're going to use that in a second. So let's go ahead and just create a button, and let's say this was for saving a user. So as this saves, it's going to display a button there, not much of anything, but we have a save user button. So now Tailwind gives us this container class, but if you were to look at the source, it really just sets a max width on the element. So on our container element, we have a max width of say 1024. And if I wanted to go ahead and add some padding to this, or maybe I wanted to center this, we could use something like MX Auto. And so MX Auto is basically saying, hey, I want margin on the x-axis, and I want you to set that to auto. So both x-axis on the left and the right, we're going to have a margin of auto, which basically centers our design. So as I start to pull this out, we can see that we would have the exact same padding on both sides. So one way that I could do that too is I can come up here and I want to say BG, so background color, actually BG blue, and maybe I would set that to 100. So as that saves, I'll get a background, and then as I do this, you can see that it's still centered. So I'm going to actually remove that. So again, if you are interested in all of these different utility classes, I would come back to the documentation. You can always come up here and do a search. And so I'm not going to search right now because I do want to just kind of go through a couple of these. So that spacing that we talked about, this deals with everything like padding, margin, widths, and heights. You'll see me type out a lot of stuff like this, like P2 is the second scale of padding. If you want to do things like padding on the y-axis or padding on the x-axis or padding just for the top, you can do top, bottom, left, right. And again, if you want to go through here, you can kind of look through here, but it'll kind of break down all of these. But then you can look here and see what the default spacing scale is. So when I say padding 1, it's not 1 pixel. It's actually 0.25 rem. So everything is based off the browser's default font size, which is 16. So that is twice as much spacing as 8, for example. So one spacing unit is equal to 0.25 rem, which translates usually roughly to 4 pixels. So you can see a 1 is 4 pixels, a 2 is 8 pixels, 12, 16, 20. As you start to see, this would go up. Now this would completely change if you overrode the default browser's font size, but if you stick with that, these are a general spacing scale for that. So when I come in here and I have this button here, maybe I want it off the top a little bit, or maybe I wanted padding on both the top and bottom. So I can come in here and say padding Y, I want you to go ahead and give me 2 of those. So that is the top and the bottom. Maybe that's not enough, so we can come in and say padding Y is 4. Cool, so now we've got the start of our application. Now I want to go ahead and style this button. So what we're going to do is we're going to come in here and I'm going to close this a little bit, give us a little more room, and we're going to say class, and we're going to start to add some styles to this. So we're going to say BG green is 500. So now we'll get a nice green background. I'm going to say text white, text white. And that's starting to look good. Now we're going to add some padding to this. So I could just add padding 4 to the entire thing. But if we do that, we can see that that doesn't look that great, right? Like we probably want more padding on the x-axis than on the y-axis. So I might say something like padding x is equal to 4, padding y is equal to 2. And that looks a little bit better. And I also want the button itself to have rounded corners. So I'm going to round them. I'm also going to give it a drop shadow. So we'll get a nice little shadow on it. And finally, if I hover over it, I want to kind of give some indication to the user. So I would say hover. My hover state is going to be a BG green. And I'm just going to drop that green one down one. And now I get this nice little hover state. So that's pretty cool. We're able to create this nice button, and we didn't have to like give it a class of like BTN and then BTN green and go into our styles and like add all these styles, right? Like we could just do it right here. Now I mentioned before, we'll look at another example. If you were going to use this same button style for 20 buttons across your application, we can extract that out into its own style using Tailwind's @apply annotation. So let's come back here because I think one of the questions that I had right away is like, where are you getting those colors from? So again, I come back to the documentation and you can look through how to customize the colors, but what I want to look at is the default color palette here, and you can see we have black and white, and then we have grays. So gray 100 is this color, gray 900 is this color. So every group of colors goes from 100 to 900, and it just gives you a bunch of really nice default colors that you can work with. Again, you can do some customization once you set it up in a project if you want to add like a very specific color, but I find that I don't need that all the time. So okay, so that is pretty much all I wanted to show you on CodePen. This is a really good way to get started without having to set up a local project and really just play around with Tailwind and start to get familiar with all of the utility classes. The second way I'm going to show you how to get started with Tailwind CSS is to use the CDN. So if you go over to installation and you look down here on the right, you can go to use Tailwind via CDN. So it's important to know that there's a couple things that you can't take advantage of if you're using the CDN. Things like customizing Tailwind's default theme. You can't use those directives that I mentioned before, like add apply. You can't enable features like group hover, and you can't install third-party plugins. To get the most out of it, Tailwind, you should really install it via NPM. And that is what we're going to do next, but I just want to show you how you can just drop a CDN script here and get started. So we're going to create a new HTML file. We'll call this index.html. We will scaffold some of this out here and say hello. Oops. Hello, Tailwind CSS. And we'll go ahead and paste that below. So now with that in place, I should be able to come in here and go class equals bg blue 100. And I'm going to go ahead and run this using live server. So if you don't have live server or know what it is, it's an extension for Visual Studio Code. You can also install it via NPM. And it just allows you to run a local live server with whatever you want to start up with. So I want to start up the index.html with the local live server. And all that's going to do is open it in the browser at this address. And you can see I got that nice blue background. So now what I can do is come in here. And we'll say .container. And in our container, I actually want to set up that MX auto again. And we'll set up some padding of 2. Next, I'll set up an H1. And let's copy that button from before. Okay, so if we go back to the browser, we see this hello Tailwind CSS and our button from before. Now you see I used an H1 and I don't really have something that looks like a heading 1, right? Well, that's because we do get a reset on a lot of the typography. And so what we need to do is actually come in and define what we want an H1 to look like. So it's very unopinionated on a lot of things. It allows you to really customize everything. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to say that I want my text to be, obviously I want it to be a little bit larger, right? So I'm going to say I want this to be 4XL. So let's go ahead and save that, and that looks pretty good, but I also want that to be bold, so I might say that I want it to be bold. And I also might want it to be blue, but maybe a little bit darker. And there we go. So now we were just able to add those styles right in. So obviously you may not want to do that to every H1, right? Like if you knew that was going to be your H1 style across your entire application, then again, you may want to add a custom class for that, and that way you could just use those utility classes in all H1s. And we'll see how we can do that in the next example as we start to set up a project using NPM and use the customization of Tailwind and dive in and really start to take advantage of the full power of Tailwind. So we'll do that in the next demo. Right, so the third way that we're going to look at getting started with Tailwind CSS is to actually install it via NPM. So again, if you're in the documentation, you go over to installation, you can find a lot of the things that we're going to talk about here, but you can just follow along and I'll go through these steps together. So I'm going to close this. And the first thing that we need to get started with this is we need a package.json. So I'm going to run npm init-y. And so with the y, we're just going to get the default. So we get the package.json that looks like this. And what I want to do now is actually install Tailwind CSS. So I'm going to npm install. You can actually shorten this to I. I'm going to install Tailwind CSS, and that's going to install what we need to get started. So you'll see it added the node modules directory. Okay, and so to get started, I'm actually going to create a couple directories here. So I'm going to create a directory, and we'll call this source. I'm going to create another directory. We're going to call this public. And in the source directory, I'm going to create a new file, and we're going to call this tailwind.css. So if we go back to the documentation, we're going to add Tailwind to our CSS. So we use the Tailwind directive to inject Tailwind's base components and their utilities. So all this is doing is in the source file, we're saying, hey, I want you to go ahead and, I don't know why that didn't copy. All this is going to do is once we actually build our project, Tailwind's going to look at those directives and say, okay, so first you need the base CSS, then you need any components, and then you need any utilities. So it'll replace those directives with the actual generated CSS. So this is also where you would place any custom CSS that you wanted to add, because it'll take this file, build what it needs to based on those directives and any custom CSS, and create an actual distributed file or build file that you could use. So then in public, well, let's back up. So all we can do now is let's go in here and create a new script, and we're going to call this build. And what we want to do is use Tailwind CSS, and we want to use the build command from Tailwind CSS. And it first takes an argument of the source file, and then the second argument is the output file. So we're going to go ahead and say our source file is tailwind.css. And we want to output that to public, and let's just say again tailwind.css. So now with this script in place, we can go ahead and run npm run build, and it's going to go through building Tailwind. So now if we look at public Tailwind, we get this file, and it starts with this normalize, and you see that it has a bunch of styles in it. So this is basically, it looked at that Tailwind CSS file, it saw those directives, and it replaced those directives with the equivalent of Tailwind's code, right? So you see a bunch of code in here, and this is the kind of code that we're going to, or the styles that we're going to use. So now what we can do is in public, I can come in here and I can say new file, index.html. Again, I'll scaffold out an HTML. And this is going to say hello Tailwind CSS. And so now what I need to do is just refer to that style, that CSS file. So I can come in here and say a link, and this is Tailwind CSS. So now if I were to go ahead and go back up to that other, the one that we used from the CDN, and I just replace that here. And now what I can do is go ahead and open this with Live Server, and it looks exactly the same. So that tells me that we've gotten Tailwind installed correctly. So now the question becomes, like, why would you do it this way? Why wouldn't you just drop the CDN in? Again, you get to start to take advantage of a lot of things. So one of which is being able to come into the source file here. And as I said before, what if all of our H1s looked like this? What I'm going to do is actually take this out and come in here, and I'm going to say, all right, hey, all of my H1s are going to look like that. So I want you to apply those utility classes. So I want them to be text for Excel, I want a bold font, and I want them to be blue 500. So if I save this and come back down here and say clear, npm run build. And so now I don't have those classes on my H1. So if I go ahead and open up with Live Server, I still see that blue because we've defined that custom style in our source file. So that's pretty cool, but there's one more thing to take advantage of. If we go back over to the documentation, we want to look at configuring Tailwind. So if we get on to configuration, because Tailwind is a framework for building user interfaces, it's been designed up with the customization in mind. So by default, Tailwind will look for an optional, so we don't need this. Everything is working without this, tailwind.config.js at the root of your project. Now you don't have to copy and paste this in. You can actually run this nifty little command here, npx tailwind CSS init. And so if we go back to Visual Studio Code, npx tailwind init, we'll get this file in the root of our project. And this just contains our theme, which we can extend, variants, and plugins. So here is where you can really start to customize Tailwind based on your needs. So if you found that like a particular margin, or you wanted like an extra color, or you just needed different font families, there are a bunch of ways to go ahead and or not a bunch of ways. This is the way to configure Tailwind, customize Tailwind to use anything that you actually need. So that's pretty cool too. I think what I'll just kind of leave us with is there's a lot more to Tailwind. Obviously, if you start digging through the documentation, you see that you have a whole bunch of layout stuff. So you have things like the container we talked about, floats and clears, overflows. Then you have things like Flexbox. So if you're really like Flexbox and Grid, which I love using, you can still use them within Tailwind. And actually, it makes it kind of easier in certain situations. So if you look at Grid and you just want to define some columns, you might just have some code that looks like this, where you have grid calls 3 with a gap of 4, and then you define your elements within there. It goes into spacing, sizing, typography, backgrounds, borders, tables, some of the tables in here, transitions, a whole bunch of useful information here in the documentation. And like I said, it can be a little overwhelming at first, because you have to think to yourself, oh, well, I have to like memorize all of these, but you really don't. You can get some IntelliSense there in Visual Studio Code, and the more you use it, the more you just get used to the different utility classes. Another reason I really am excited about Tailwind is Tailwind UI. So if you're here on the site, go check out Tailwind UI. It's the component library that Adam Wathan and Steve Sugar have put together, and it is amazing. And I plan on doing a video on that coming shortly. And so again, I wanted to create this one first, so I always had something to reference back to if folks were new to Tailwind and were trying to get started with it. So I think with that, we will stop this tutorial here. So question of the day: are you currently using any CSS frameworks? If so, which one and why? Please go ahead and comment below and let me know your thoughts on that. If you found value in this video, please go ahead and leave me a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button, and as always, friends, happy coding.